The kamikaze pilots of World War II represent one of history's most haunting military tactics. The word kamikaze, meaning divine wind, referred to the suicide pilots of Imperial Japan who deliberately crashed their explosive-laden aircraft into Allied warships during the final desperate months of the Pacific War. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in these attacks, killing more than 7,000 Allied naval personnel and sinking or damaging hundreds of ships. The world remembers them as fanatical warriors who willingly embraced death for their emperor. But this narrative, while dramatic, obscures a more complex and deeply human reality. What happened to the kamikaze pilots who survived? It's a question that reveals uncomfortable truths about wartime propaganda, coercion, and the psychological trauma that haunted these men for decades after the war ended. Contrary to popular belief, a significant number of kamikaze pilots did survive the war. Some returned from missions due to mechanical failures or bad weather. Others were shot down but rescued. Many more were still in training or awaiting their orders when Japan surrendered in August 1945. Their stories challenge our understanding of the kamikaze phenomenon and reveal the human cost of a military strategy that treated young men as expendable weapons. By late 1944, Japan's military situation had become catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered devastating losses at the battles of Midway in 1942 and Leyte Gulf in October 1944. American forces were advancing island by island across the Pacific, and Japan's qualitative and quantitative inferiority in both aircraft and trained pilots had become overwhelming. In a single day during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, an engagement the Americans nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost more airmen than they had managed to train in an entire year before the war began. The mathematics was simple and brutal. Japan could not replace its losses fast enough, and conventional attacks against heavily defended Allied ships had become suicide missions anyway, with minimal chance of success. Into this desperate situation stepped Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who proposed formalizing what was already happening unofficially. If pilots were dying anyway in futile conventional attacks, why not deliberately use them as guided missiles to maximize the damage they could inflict? The first official kamikaze mission occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led a squadron of 50 fighters, each loaded with 250-kilogram bombs against American escort carriers. One of these aircraft struck USS San Lo, sinking the first major Allied warship loss to a kamikaze attack. The immediate success of this mission led to a rapid expansion of the program. The kamikaze strategy was born from a cold calculation. Japanese military planners estimated that approximately 1 in 6 kamikaze sorties would successfully hit a ship, compared to far lower success rates for conventional bombing runs. In practice, the statistics would prove even more favorable than expected. During the first 4 months of kamikaze attacks from October 1944 to January 1945, suicide attacks achieved a success rate of over 34%, compared to just 2% for conventional attacks. This made kamikaze tactics 7 to 10 times more effective than regular bombing runs. For a nation facing certain defeat, this seemed like a rational, if horrifying, military strategy. The enduring image of kamikaze pilots is one of fanatical young men eagerly volunteering to die for their emperor, screaming "Banzai" as they dove toward their targets. This narrative was carefully cultivated by Japanese wartime propaganda and, to some extent, accepted by Allied forces and later by popular culture. The reality was far more complicated and considerably darker. In the early stages of the kamikaze program, when Vice Admiral Onishi personally requested volunteers at Mabalacat Air Base in October 1944, all 23 pilots asked did indeed volunteer. Reports from this period suggest that volunteers initially outnumbered available aircraft by as much as 3 to 1. However, this apparent enthusiasm must be understood within its cultural and social context. Japan in 1944 was a society where refusal of military service brought not just personal shame but potential consequences for one's entire family. The Imperial Rescript on Education, passed in 1890, had required students to ritually recite an oath to offer themselves courageously to the state. Death in service to the emperor was framed as the highest honor, and those who died in battle were promised enshrinement at Yasukuni Shrine, where the emperor himself would pay respects twice yearly. As the war continued and the need for kamikaze pilots grew more desperate, the veneer of volunteerism began to crack. By 1945, many pilots were being recruited through methods that can only be described as coercive. University students who had previously been exempt from military service found themselves drafted as Japan ran out of troops. They were presented with a questionnaire containing a single multiple-choice question. Do you desire earnestly do not wish to be involved in kamikaze attacks? The men were required to circle their choice and sign their name. On paper, this appeared to offer a real option to decline. In practice, the requirement to sign one's name to a refusal created enormous pressure. Who would want to be the only person in a group to publicly declare unwillingness to sacrifice for the nation? What consequences might such a refusal bring for one's family? Interviews with surviving pilots reveal the intense psychological pressure they faced. Many describe feeling trapped by social expectations, family honor, and peer pressure rather than driven by genuine enthusiasm for suicide. One survivor recalled making his decision. I applied for the unit because I thought it was the right thing to do, but I can't say I really wanted to die. Another remembered the questionnaire. We sat there with our pens, and everyone around me was marking earnestly wish. What else could I do? The private letters and diaries of student pilots, later studied by anthropologists, reveal young men torn by doubt, fear, and longing for life, even as they outwardly accepted their fate. They wrote about missing their families, about hopes and dreams they would never realize, and about the fundamental unfairness of being asked to die so young. The training process for kamikaze pilots reflected Japan's desperate circumstances. In the early stages of the program, pilots selected for special attack missions were experienced aviators who had completed standard flight training. As casualties mounted and the need for kamikazes increased, the selection criteria broadened dramatically. By 1945, even pilots still in the middle of their basic training were being designated as kamikaze candidates. The training itself became abbreviated and focused, designed not to create well-rounded combat pilots but to produce human-guided missiles. Traditional flight training emphasized both takeoff and landing procedures, along with aerial combat tactics, navigation, and aircraft maintenance. Kamikaze training eliminated much of this. Pilots learned how to take off and how to steer their aircraft toward a target, but landing practice became largely unnecessary. Why waste time teaching men skills they would never need? The training focused instead on the specific maneuvers required for a suicide attack, how to dive at the correct angle, how to aim for the vulnerable points on a ship between the bridge and the smokestacks, and how to maintain control of the aircraft, even while under anti-aircraft fire. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more important than the flight training. Pilots underwent intense indoctrination designed to make them accept their imminent deaths. They attended lectures glorifying sacrifice for the emperor, watched propaganda films celebrating previous kamikaze successes, and had personal discussions with senior officers about the honor of their mission. The training manual issued to kamikaze pilots provided detailed instructions, not just on how to attack, but on how to think and prepare mentally. It urged pilots to attain a high level of spiritual training and to keep your health in the very best condition. These instructions were meant to help pilots achieve a state of mind where death became not just acceptable but welcomed. Cultural elements were woven throughout the training. The cherry blossom became the symbol of the kamikaze, representing beauty, transience, and the willingness to fall at the peak of youth. Pilots wrote death poems in the samurai tradition, composed farewell letters to their families, and received gifts from their mothers including seninbari, a belt of 1,000 stitches, meant to provide spiritual protection. Before missions, pilots were given ceremonial sake and often wore white headbands with rising sun imagery. In some units, pilots scheduled for their final sortie were entitled to a few days of leave to visit their families one last time, a gesture that seems almost cruelly compassionate. Yet beneath all this ceremony and indoctrination, many pilots never fully accepted their fate. Survivors later recalled that by the time they completed basic training, most had intellectually accepted their imminent deaths, but this acceptance remained fragile. The sense of attachment to life, they said, was numbed rather than eliminated. The propaganda and ritual created a psychological armor that helped young men face the unthinkable, but it was armor that could crack under too much scrutiny or stress. The popular image of kamikaze missions portrays them as one-way trips with no possibility of return. In reality, approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of kamikaze flights did not reach their intended targets. Some pilots crashed into the sea due to navigation errors or mechanical problems. Others were shot down by Allied fighters or anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. And a significant number returned to base, their missions aborted for various reasons. What happened to these men upon their return reveals much about the true nature of the Kamikaze program. Japanese military authorities officially instructed pilots that they were permitted to return if their aircraft developed mechanical problems, if weather conditions made the mission impossible, or if they could not locate their target. This permission to return was not merely humanitarian, it reflected the practical reality that trained pilots, even those designated for suicide missions, were a scarce resource that Japan could not afford to waste unnecessarily. An official policy document stated clearly that a pilot should not waste his life lightly if conditions prevented a successful attack. It made more sense to preserve the pilot and aircraft for another attempt rather than having them die pointlessly. Pilots who returned due to mechanical failure, severe weather, or inability to locate their target in poor visibility were generally accepted back without punishment, provided they could demonstrate that their return was caused by factors beyond their control. These men were debriefed about what had gone wrong, and their missions were simply rescheduled. The military needed to maintain morale and could not afford to treat pilots harshly for circumstances they could not control. One survivor, Kenichiro Onyuki, was forced to land his bomb-laden plane in April 1945 due to engine trouble while en route to attack the American fleet off Okinawa. He was rescued by the Japanese Navy, interrogated about his mission failure, and faced no punishment. When the war ended months later, he had survived not through cowardice but through mechanical failure. However, pilots who returned without clear justification faced a very different reception. Those who could not prove that external factors had prevented their mission completion were suspected of cowardice or lack of commitment. These men underwent harsh interrogation by military authorities who questioned their dedication and courage. While they were not executed, they faced various forms of punishment, both physical and psychological. The treatment was carefully calibrated, harsh enough to discourage others from seeking excuses to return, but not so severe that it would incapacitate the pilot for future missions. After all, they would be sent out again. The experience of returning from a failed mission was psychologically devastating. Pilots who came back often felt intense guilt, especially if others from their squadron had died while they survived. They faced the silent judgment of their comrades and the explicit skepticism of their superiors. To be assigned to another mission meant living through the mental preparation for death a second time, knowing that once again they would have to overcome the instinct for survival and force themselves into that final dive. Some pilots returned from multiple attempted missions. In one documented case, a pilot who returned 9 times was eventually executed for cowardice, though this appears to have been an extreme exception rather than standard procedure. To prevent pilots from losing their resolve, the military implemented several measures. Kamikaze pilots often flew in squadrons rather than alone, which increased peer pressure and made it psychologically harder to turn back when others were continuing toward their deaths. Before flights, pilots were given alcohol, their liquid courage, to dull their fear and strengthen their determination. There were also persistent rumors, though these have been proven false, that pilots were given only enough fuel to reach their targets but not enough to return. This myth has been debunked. Planes were actually fueled for maximum explosive impact upon crash, and besides, as one officer noted, there was no need for such measures given the social and military pressures already in place. While most Kamikaze pilots who returned to base did so before completing their attack, a tiny number survived even after reaching enemy ships. These cases were extraordinarily rare and often involved unusual circumstances. Koru Hasegawa represents perhaps the most remarkable example. On May 25, 1945, as a lieutenant junior grade, he was piloting a bomber toward American task forces east of Okinawa. After dodging anti-aircraft fire from the battleship USS West Virginia, his aircraft took a hit from the destroyer USS Callaghan and crashed into the sea. Hasegawa was severely injured, but the destroyer crew rescued him. The other 2 crew members in his aircraft did not survive. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war and was eventually repatriated to Japan. Hasegawa's case is instructive because it challenges the very definition of a kamikaze survivor. As he later explained in interviews, there are technically no kamikaze survivors. If you were deployed as a kamikaze and you succeeded, you died. He was careful to distinguish between kamikaze pilots, who by definition completed their missions and died, and those like himself who were assigned to a kamikaze mission but returned alive. This distinction may seem semantic, but it mattered greatly to those involved. The kamikaze identity was so bound up with death that survival seemed to contradict the very nature of what it meant to be kamikaze. A few pilots were shot down by Allied fighters before reaching their targets and managed to bail out or ditch at sea, where they were sometimes rescued by Japanese forces. Others, in the chaos of the final months of the war, found ways to abort their missions without clear justification, flying their planes into the ocean rather than into enemy ships. One survivor recalled, "We sat in silence, pretending to be brave. But inside all I could think about was my mother's face." Another admitted, "When it came time to dive, I couldn't do it. I crashed into the sea instead. I told them it was mechanical failure." These men lived with the knowledge that they had chosen life over duty, a choice that would haunt many of them for decades. To understand the fate of survivors, it helps to understand the scale of the Kamikaze program and its impact. From October 1944 until Japan's surrender in August 1945, approximately 3,800 to 4,000 Kamikaze pilots died in attacks. The mission sank at least 47 Allied vessels and damaged approximately 300 others, with some estimates going as high as 350 ships hit. The human cost to Allied forces was severe, more than 7,000 naval personnel killed and nearly 5,000 wounded. During the Battle of Okinawa alone from April to June 1945, more than 1,900 kamikaze sorties were flown, resulting in at least 26 American ships sunk and 225 damaged, with over 3,000 American deaths. However, these numbers must be seen in context. While kamikaze attacks were indeed more effective than conventional bombing, achieving hit rates of 19 to 34% compared to 1 to 2% for regular attacks, they could not alter the war's outcome. No strategically important ships were sunk. No aircraft carriers, battleships, or heavy cruisers were lost to kamikaze attack, though some were severely damaged. The vast majority of vessels sunk were destroyers, destroyer escorts, and landing craft. The attacks inflicted casualties and delayed operations but could not prevent the American advance toward Japan. From a purely military perspective, the kamikaze campaign consumed approximately 2,800 aircraft and 4,000 pilots without changing the strategic situation. Japan was sacrificing its last remaining pilots in attacks that caused damage but could not prevent defeat. For the pilots themselves, the statistics were stark. Success meant certain death, failure meant survival but also shame, guilt, and the prospect of being sent out again. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, thousands of pilots who had been training for kamikaze missions or awaiting their orders were suddenly and unexpectedly dismissed to resume ordinary lives in the shadow of the death they had accepted. For many, this abrupt reprieve brought not relief but confusion and a profound sense of purposelessness. They had mentally prepared themselves to die and had said goodbye to their families. Now they had to figure out how to live. When Japan surrendered, approximately 2,500 to 3,000 kamikaze pilots or trainees had survived the war, either because they had returned from failed missions or because the war ended before their turn came. They stepped into a devastated country struggling with defeat, occupation, and the psychological trauma of losing a war that had consumed millions of lives. For these survivors, the transition to peacetime was extraordinarily difficult. In the immediate post-war years, kamikaze survivors faced significant social stigma. Post-war Japanese society saw them as uncomfortable reminders of Japan's militaristic past and the extreme measures the nation had taken in its final desperate months. In a blackened ruin of a country trying to rebuild and move forward, the presence of young men who had trained to die but lived was awkward at best. They were viewed as the ultimate caricature of the Japanese warrior as zealot, symbols of everything that had gone wrong with wartime Japan. Some civilians looked at them and thought they had died, like dogs, in futile attacks that accomplished nothing. Others wondered why they had survived when so many had died. Were they cowards? Had they shirked their duty? Many survivors found it difficult to reintegrate into society. Some struggled to find employment, facing questions about their wartime service that carried implied criticism. Others found that potential marriage partners and their families were wary of men associated with the kamikaze program. The survivors often chose not to speak about their experiences, keeping silent about a past that brought neither honor nor sympathy. Hisashi Tezuka, who survived because the war ended just as he was en route to his mission, later recalled that he never told the American farmers he worked with after the war that he had been a kamikaze pilot. The subject was simply too complicated, too painful, and too likely to be misunderstood. The stigma was particularly severe in the first decades after the war. Japanese society was grappling with its own guilt and shame over the war, trying to understand how the nation had pursued such a destructive path. In this environment, the kamikaze represented the extreme of that destructive ideology, and survivors bore the weight of that association. They were neither heroes nor victims in the eyes of many. They were simply embarrassments, men who represented a shameful chapter that most Japanese wanted to forget. As one survivor put it, "We did what we did for military purposes, but nobody wanted to hear about it afterwards." This stigma began to diminish only about 50 years after the war ended, as scholars and publishers began to distribute the survivors' stories, and as Japanese society became more willing to examine the complexities of its wartime history. Books, articles, and documentaries featuring interviews with survivors helped humanize them and challenge the stereotypes. Organizations of former kamikaze pilots began to speak more openly about their experiences. Asushi Takatsuka, a survivor who became an elementary school art teacher, published a quarterly newsletter for more than 20 years, creating what became an unprecedented compilation of facts and testimonies from surviving pilots. His work helped other survivors cope with the stigma of not completing their missions and provided a space where they could finally tell their stories. Perhaps the heaviest burden carried by kamikaze survivors was psychological. Many experienced what we would now recognize as survivor's guilt, a condition where those who live through traumatic events in which others died feel intense guilt about their survival. Kenichiro Onuki, who survived due to engine failure, said his survival gave him a sense of a burden he knew he wasn't supposed to be, talking to people decades after the war ended, that he should have died crashing into an American warship. Yet he had lived, and he spent the rest of his life trying to reconcile that survival with the memory of comrades who had gone to their deaths. Many survivors were haunted by specific memories. Onuki recalled saying goodbye to his pilot comrades after his plane developed a mechanical defect. He had made a bouquet of azaleas to give them, and one had said, "I am going ahead of you. I wanted to meet my destiny with you. I'm sorry." Onuki remembered, "They were the saddest eyes I ever saw." It's often said that before one's death a person has that really sad expression in their eyes, like a deep sea fish looking up at the blue sky above. He carried that image with him for the rest of his life, the memory of men flying to certain death while he remained behind. Other survivors struggled with the question of meaning. If the war had been a mistake, if the sacrifices had been futile, what did that say about their willingness to die? If, on the other hand, the war had been justified, why had they survived when others had carried through with the ultimate sacrifice? These questions had no comfortable answers. Shigeyoshi Hamazono, who flew 3 aborted or intercepted suicide missions and survived all 3, reflected decades later, "I still don't think it was a mistake. I'm proud that I flew as a kamikaze, and I'm glad I came back. We did what we did out of a love for our parents, for the nation." Then, after a pause, he added, "Just like suicide bombers. We did it out of love for something." The comparison seemed to trouble him, highlighting the moral complexity of actions taken in wartime under extreme pressure. For many survivors, the psychological burden was made worse by silence. Unable to speak openly about their experiences due to social stigma, they carried their memories and guilt alone. Some refused to discuss the war at all, even with their own families. Others spoke about it only in the most general terms. This enforced silence prevented them from processing their trauma in healthy ways. When survivors finally began to speak out decades later, many described feeling relief at being able to tell their stories, to explain the pressures they had faced and the impossible choices they had been given. Some survivors channeled their experiences into efforts to prevent future wars. They spoke to students about the realities of the Kamikaze program, emphasizing that they had not been the fanatical volunteers of propaganda, but ordinary young men placed in extraordinary circumstances. They stressed the waste of young lives and the futility of the missions. Others struggled with anger at the military leaders who had asked them to die, or at the propaganda that had glorified their sacrifice. A few maintained that their willingness to serve had been honorable, even if the war itself had been wrong. One of the most important contributions of survivor testimonies has been correcting the central myths about kamikaze pilots. The popular image of young fanatics eagerly rushing to die for their emperor, burning with nationalist fervor and shouting "Banzai" as they crashed into ships was never accurate. This was propaganda, created by Japanese authorities to boost morale and later perpetuated by Allied forces and popular culture, because it fit comfortably into narratives about Japanese fanaticism and otherness. The reality, as survivors emphasized, was far more human. These were mostly young men, many just teenagers or in their early 20s, who found themselves trapped by social pressure, family honor, military coercion, and a culture that made refusal almost unthinkable. Many harbored serious doubts about their missions. Private letters and diaries reveal young men writing about their fear, their desire to live, and their resentment at being asked to die so young. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led one of the first official kamikaze attacks and died in the strike against USS St. Lo, told a war correspondent before his mission, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots. I am not going on this mission for the Emperor or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to." Survivors also corrected other persistent myths. The story that kamikaze planes were given only enough fuel to reach their targets, but not enough to return, has been thoroughly debunked. Planes actually carried maximum fuel loads to create larger explosions upon impact. The idea that all pilots were volunteers has been exposed as propaganda covering a system that, especially in the war's final months, relied heavily on coercion and social pressure. The notion that pilots achieved their deaths gladly and at peace has been replaced by a more accurate understanding of young men struggling with fear and the instinct for survival even as they prepared to die. Perhaps most importantly, survivors have emphasized that understanding the kamikaze phenomenon requires understanding the desperate circumstances Japan faced in late 1944 and 1945. The missions were not the product of some uniquely Japanese death wish or cultural fanaticism. They were a military tactic adopted by a nation facing certain defeat, using the only resources it had left: young men and obsolete aircraft. Similar suicide tactics were briefly considered by Nazi Germany in the war's final months, though never implemented on the same scale. The willingness to sacrifice individual lives for military objectives, survivors pointed out, is not unique to any one culture. It appears in many desperate military situations throughout history. Modern Japan has a complicated relationship with the memory of kamikaze pilots. On one hand, they are commemorated at sites like the Chiron Peace Museum and enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, places that emphasize their sacrifice and dedication. Some Japanese, particularly those of nationalist inclination, continue to view them as heroes who gave their lives for their country. On the other hand, many Japanese see them as tragic victims of a militaristic government that demanded too much, young men who were manipulated and sacrificed for a losing cause. This latter view has become more prominent as Japanese society has engaged in more critical examination of its wartime actions. The surviving pilots themselves have contributed to this more nuanced understanding. Their testimonies have made clear that the kamikaze story is not one of simple heroism or simple victimhood, but rather a deeply human story of people facing impossible choices under extreme pressure. Some survivors express pride in their service while also acknowledging the tragedy of wasted lives. Others are more critical of the militarism that created the kamikaze program. Most simply emphasize that they were ordinary young men doing what they felt they had to do in extraordinary circumstances. There has never been a large, scale reconciliation process or official acknowledgement of what Kamikaze survivors experienced, either during the war or in its aftermath. The stigma they faced in the immediate post-war years gradually faded but was never formally addressed or apologized for. However, the increased willingness to listen to their stories and publish their testimonies represents a form of informal recognition. Museums and memorials have begun to present more complex narratives that include survivor perspectives alongside commemoration of the dead. Some survivors have participated in reconciliation efforts with former enemies. The case of Koru Hasegawa, rescued by USS Caligan after being shot down, is particularly notable. 50 years after the war, he spoke with American naval historians, sharing his story and helping to fill in historical details about Kamikaze operations. These personal acts of reconciliation, small as they may be, have helped humanize both the Kamikaze pilots and their American adversaries, revealing the common humanity that existed even in the midst of brutal warfare. The Kamikaze pilots who survived challenge our understanding of one of World War II's most dramatic military tactics. Their stories reveal that the Kamikaze phenomenon was not what wartime propaganda claimed, not a spontaneous outpouring of fanatical devotion, but a desperate military strategy that exploited young men trapped by social pressure, military coercion, and a culture that made refusal almost impossible. These were not zealots eagerly embracing death, but frightened young men, many of them teenagers, doing what they felt they had to do in circumstances we can barely imagine. Those who survived carried heavy burdens. Pilots who returned from failed missions faced suspicion and shame. Those who were still training when the war ended had to figure out how to live after preparing themselves to die. All of them faced post-war stigma in a society that viewed them as uncomfortable reminders of Japan's most extreme wartime measures. For decades, many kept silent about their experiences, unable to speak about a past that brought neither honor nor sympathy in the new Japan that emerged from the war's ashes. Only in recent decades, as survivors have aged and historians have sought out their testimonies, have these stories begun to be told. What emerges is a more complex and more human picture than the myths would suggest. These were not the one-dimensional fanatics of propaganda, but individuals with doubts, fears, hopes, and dreams. Some few found ways to survive, whether through mechanical failure, weather conditions, capture by enemy forces, or simply because the war ended before their turn came. Their survival allowed them to correct the historical record, to explain the pressures they faced, and to bear witness to a chapter of history that might otherwise have been understood only through the lens of wartime propaganda. The question of what happened to Kamikaze pilots who survived does not have a simple answer. It has thousands of answers, each one a human story of fear and courage, coercion and choice, guilt and survival. Some built productive lives and kept their pasts private. Others struggled with trauma and stigma for decades. Many found ways to make meaning from their experiences, speaking to new generations about the realities of war and the cost of militarism. Their stories remind us that behind every military statistic and every wartime tactic are individual human beings whose lives are shaped, and often damaged, by forces beyond their control. Understanding what happened to these survivors helps us understand not just the Kamikaze phenomenon, but the broader human costs of war itself.